the architect's wife and the unbreakable nanny. They whispered that no caregiver had ever survived in the Morrison estate. Not a single one. The towering stone gates of the mansion, nestled in the most exclusive hills of Malibu, commanded attention from anyone who dared to glance their way. Every marble step leading to the entrance gleamed as though it had never known a footprint. Manicured olive trees lined the pathway in perfect symmetry, their silver leaves catching the California sun like nature's own jewelry. Beyond them stood the imposing glass and steel structure, modern, breathtaking, and utterly intimidating. It was a fortress for the wealthy elite, so flawless it seemed almost artificial. But within those pristine walls lay a war zone. At the center of this battlefield was the young lady of the house, Victoria Morrison. Victoria was only 29, more than 20 years younger than her architect billionaire husband. Society columnists called her a gold digger, a beautiful accessory acquired for status. Yet even her harshest critics couldn't argue with one undeniable truth. She was absolutely stunning. Tall and statuesque, with raven black hair that fell in perfect waves past her shoulders. Victoria's emerald green eyes held both beauty and menace in equal measure. She didn't simply move through rooms, she commanded them in designer stilettos. Even casual moments in the garden required couture dresses from Paris fashion houses. A trail of expensive perfume announced her presence long before she appeared, as if to warn everyone of her untouchable status. But Victoria's beauty masked a terrifying cruelty. Her tongue was sharp enough to draw blood, capable of delivering wounds that never healed. Victoria was notorious for striking household staff without provocation. A backhand, a shove, or a contemptuous gesture could happen at any moment for any reason. The most chilling aspect wasn't the physical abuse. It was the poison of her prejudice. Every caregiver in the household was a working-class Latina woman, and each had suffered Victoria's insults about their heritage and background. She called them worthless, ignorant, beneath her notice. Her gaze burned with disgust whenever they came too close. In just 7 months since becoming David Morrison's new wife, 11 Latina nannies had fled the mansion. Some escaped in the middle of the night, sobbing as they ran down the winding driveway, swearing never to return even if it meant unemployment. Others disappeared before sunrise, too terrified to look back. One had actually scaled the security fence in her bare feet, stumbling through the darkness until her soles were bloody, too desperate to stop for her only pair of shoes. She ran as though a single backward glance would trap her in a nightmare forever. These women had all faced hardship before, but the humiliation and deep-rooted racism from Victoria shattered them. They surrendered, fleeing what appeared to be paradise, but felt like purgatory. Neighbors began spreading stories about the Morrison Mansion curse, that no Latina nanny could last 6 weeks there. Some even advised young women to refuse the position entirely, fearing emotional scars that might never heal. Victoria dismissed the rumors completely. To her, it was simply a matter of hiring and firing. Staff were nothing more than expendable tools, no different from her jewelry collection, replaceable whenever she pleased. Every morning, she woke in her luxurious bedroom surrounded by perfection. Yet behind those stunning emerald eyes lay nothing but a disturbing void. Even billionaire David Morrison, the most influential architect on the West Coast, remained silent about his young wife's brutality. He buried himself in designing skyscrapers across 3 continents, maintaining distance from domestic matters. As long as the house remained spotless and his reputation untarnished, Victoria's revolving door of caregivers didn't concern him. But the so-called curse was about to meet its greatest challenge, because a new woman was walking through those stone gates, a young Latina woman with determined dark eyes and a backbone of steel. Her name was Carmen Rodriguez. Unlike the others, Carmen hadn't come to hide or surrender. She had come to endure, to survive, no matter the cost in dignity or pain. And her arrival would transform the Morrison estate forever. That morning, golden California sunlight filtered through the perfectly aligned olive trees, casting an almost ethereal glow over the stone pathway leading to the Morrison mansion. Yet for Carmen Rodriguez, that warm light couldn't ease the tight knot of anxiety in her stomach. Standing before the massive gates, she stared at the gleaming glass and steel structure with a mixture of wonder and dread. Clutched in her hand was a small, weathered purse containing only a few changes of clothes and a photograph of Miguel, her 6-year-old son, lying in a hospital bed at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. Miguel was the reason Carmen stood here, the reason she was willing to enter what everyone called hell, disguised as heaven. Miguel had been born with severe autism and required specialized therapy that cost more than Carmen could earn in 2 years. She knew the price, but she also knew this job paid more than any other position she could find. Despite all the horror stories she'd heard about the young mistress Victoria Morrison, Carmen had chosen to risk everything for this opportunity. 6 months, she whispered to herself as she pressed the gate's intercom button. Just 6 months, and Miguel will have the therapy he needs. The gate swung open, revealing Patricia Wells, the Morrisons' head housekeeper. Her face was stern and unwelcoming as granite. Patricia's eyes swept over Carmen from head to toe, lingering deliberately on her brown skin as though it were a defect to be catalogued and reported. "Follow me," Patricia said coldly, offering no greeting, no introduction. As Carmen stepped into the courtyard, she felt the weight of hostile stares. Robert Chen, the estate manager, stood near a pristine white Tesla, his calculating gaze sizing her up as if betting on her survival time. Through the kitchen window, Susan Blake, the notoriously strict head chef, watched with crossed arms, her expression detached as though Carmen were merely a temporary inconvenience. They were all white, and their eyes carried a single unspoken message: "You don't belong here." Patricia led her into the grand living room where the polished concrete floors reflected the ceiling lights like a mirror. Before leaving, she tossed out a curt command: "Clean the floors. Mrs. Morrison will be down shortly." No instructions, no guidance, just a cold directive. Carmen understood what it meant. This wasn't about cleaning. It was about establishing her place in their hierarchy. She quietly picked up a microfiber cloth, knelt down, and began wiping the floor slowly, methodically, leaving not a streak or speck behind. "Do this well. Don't lose this job," she told herself. But just as she finished the final section, the sharp click of heels echoed from the floating staircase. Each step was measured, confident, and carried an undertone of quiet menace. Victoria Morrison appeared at the top of the stairs, her emerald eyes fixed on Carmen. She wore a midnight blue silk dress that hugged her figure perfectly, her black hair styled in an elaborate updo. One hand held a crystal wine glass, the other glided along the steel banister like a queen preparing to grant an audience. Her gaze moved slowly from Carmen's face to her skin, then to the calloused hands gripping the cleaning cloth. Her lips curved not in warmth but in unmistakable disdain. "The new nanny?" she asked, her voice like ice. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Carmen," Carmen replied, bowing her head respectfully. Victoria didn't respond. She descended closer, glancing over the spotless floor. Then, with calculated precision, she tilted her wine glass. The dark red liquid splashed across the concrete, creating a violent stain against the pristine surface. Carmen flinched in shock, looking up at Victoria, who smiled coldly and shook her head as if Carmen had committed an unforgivable sin. "This floor," Victoria said softly, each word like a blade, "was perfectly clean before you set foot in this house. I'll never understand why they keep sending me lazy, careless people like you." Around them, other staff members paused their work, curiosity drawing their eyes to the scene. Victoria knew this. Humiliating Carmen publicly was the entire point. "Clean it now," she ordered, her tone almost satisfied as Carmen dropped to her knees again, scrubbing while whispers of mockery filled the air. Carmen's face burned with humiliation, but she didn't cry, didn't protest. In her mind was only Miguel, waiting in that hospital room, depending on his mother to return with hope for his future. 6 months, she whispered again, her voice a silent vow. "I will not lose this job." It was in that quiet determination that Carmen unknowingly took the first step into a battle that would pit her against the most powerful woman in this storm-laden mansion. 6 months. Just 6 more months. Carmen repeated these words each morning like a prayer, as pale dawn light crept through the thin curtains. Her small room, tucked away in the mansion's service wing, had once been a storage closet, now disguised with the generous title of staff quarters. The walls were institutional white, the narrow bed squeaked with every movement. But Carmen never complained. She hadn't come here for comfort. She had come to survive for both herself and her son. After that first encounter with Victoria Morrison, Carmen knew she had to remain constantly vigilant. To Victoria, Carmen wasn't just a nanny. She was a game, a target to test endurance and pride. The first test came the very next morning. As soon as Carmen entered the kitchen, Patricia glanced at her and jerked her chin toward a silver tray. "Mrs. Morrison wants fresh orange juice every morning," she said flatly. "Exactly 2 oranges, juice at room temperature, never cold, never warm, and not a single piece of pulp in the glass." Carmen nodded quietly, selecting the ripest oranges from the modern fruit bowl on the marble counter. She squeezed the juice into a crystal glass, carefully straining out every bit of pulp with a fine mesh. Her hands were steady despite her nervousness. Her focus absolute. When she set the perfect glass of orange juice on the tray, Susan, the chef, gave her a brief, surprised look, as though she hadn't expected Carmen to succeed at such a deceptively simple task. But when Carmen brought the drink to Victoria's bedroom, the young mistress didn't even acknowledge her presence. Victoria lifted the glass, took a small sip, and immediately grimaced as if she'd tasted poison. "Too warm," she said sweetly, her tone dripping with malice. "Didn't I make myself clear, or is your comprehension just as poor as your work?" Carmen felt heat rise in her cheeks, but quickly bowed her head. "I'm very sorry, ma'am. I'll make it fresh right away." She never got the chance. In an instant, Victoria's hand flicked, sending the glass crashing to the marble floor. Shards scattered and cold orange juice splashed over Carmen's shoes, the sticky liquid seeping through the canvas. "Clean it up," Victoria ordered, her voice carrying through the room. "I don't want to step in your incompetence." Carmen knelt, the glass fragments cutting into her palms as she gathered them. She didn't cry, didn't protest, just cleaned until every shard was gone. In her mind, she saw only Miguel's trusting smile, his bright eyes despite his struggles. That image was the only thing keeping Carmen steady. Victoria watched her, the corners of her mouth lifting in cold satisfaction. Carmen's quiet endurance seemed to energize her, inspiring even crueler tests. In the days that followed, Carmen woke before sunrise, cleaning every corner of the mansion until not a speck of dust remained. Yet no matter how flawless her work, Victoria always found a reason to humiliate her in front of the staff. One afternoon, as Carmen carefully organized Victoria's extensive jewelry collection, Victoria paused beside her. "Are you sure your hands are clean enough to touch those?" she said loudly, ensuring everyone could hear. "I've heard people like you aren't very hygienic. I hope you're not contaminating my valuables." Soft chuckles rippled among the nearby staff, their amused eyes piercing Carmen's dignity. She kept her head down, swallowing the hurt, continuing to organize as if she hadn't heard. Victoria stepped closer, lowering her voice so only Carmen could hear. "I won't stop until you get the message and leave this house." The words were sharp and frozen, but Carmen looked up just once, her gaze filled with quiet determination and a shadow of sorrow. "I'll do my best, ma'am," she replied calmly, so unexpectedly composed that Victoria hesitated for a moment. "Good," Victoria said, regaining her composure, "because I'm just getting started." As Victoria's proud silhouette disappeared down the wide hallway, Carmen took a deep breath, steeling herself. Every day she endured, every insult she absorbed, brought her one day closer to saving Miguel, the son she loved more than life itself. Victoria had warned that she was just getting started, and her words quickly proved prophetic. Tension inside the Morrison mansion escalated until Carmen could barely distinguish one painful day from the next. On Thursday morning, she woke as usual before dawn, the faint light barely sufficient to guide her as she gathered supplies for another day's work. But something was wrong. The closet door, always shut tight, now stood slightly open. A chill ran down her spine as she approached and pulled it fully open. Empty. The navy blue uniform she always hung carefully the night before was gone. In its place, dangling from the wooden hanger, was a flimsy white tank top, so thin it was nearly transparent. For a long moment, Carmen stood frozen, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The message was unmistakable. "You're nothing more than a cheap plaything in this house." Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes and steadied herself. She couldn't let Victoria see her break. She wouldn't hand her that victory. Calmly, she turned to her small bag and pulled out a faded sweater and worn jeans. the clothes she'd worn before taking this job. When she entered the mansion's main dining room to begin breakfast preparations, curious eyes from the other staff locked onto her. Patricia showed open surprise mixed with disdain. Susan and Robert whispered to each other, stealing glances filled with quiet mockery, but nothing compared to the moment Victoria entered. She swept in wearing a flawless emerald gown, her gaze snapping instantly to Carmen's outfit. Within seconds, her expression shifted. "What is this?" she demanded, her cold tone blending irritation with smugness. She moved closer, as if inspecting damaged merchandise. "I'm sorry, ma'am," Carmen replied before Victoria's temper could explode. "My uniform disappeared, so I had to wear my own clothes today." Victoria paused, then let out a low, cutting laugh that echoed through the vast room, drawing every eye. "Oh, really?" she said sweetly, venom threading her words. "Or is it that you're simply more comfortable in rags? People like you must be used to clothes like that by now." Whispers rippled among the staff, but Carmen stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on some invisible point ahead. She knew Victoria was trying to provoke her, but she wouldn't give her the satisfaction. Carmen's silence only deepened Victoria's irritation. Her voice rose, determined to break Carmen down in front of everyone. "Look at her," Victoria said, gesturing toward Carmen. "This is exactly why I have to replace the help so often. I don't know where they find people like this. Dirty, uneducated, bringing nothing to my home except filth." She stepped closer still, her voice dropping to a whisper, sharpened to a blade. "Do you think your background gives you the right to behave however you please here? This isn't the barrio you're used to. There's no place here for someone as low as you." The air in the room seemed to freeze. No one moved. No one spoke. Carmen felt each word pierce her like a needle, the pain tight in her chest stealing her breath. But she refused to cry. Not now, not in front of Victoria, not in front of anyone. She bowed her head slightly, her voice calm, so calm it startled even herself. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'll do better." That simple reply hit Victoria like a slap. She'd wanted Carmen to crumble, to cry, to snap, anything that would justify throwing her out. But Carmen didn't give her that. She accepted every insult with unnerving composure. Victoria turned sharply, her hands curling into fists as she walked away, rage simmering beneath her perfect exterior. She realized for the first time that she was losing control. Carmen's calm was her defiance, and it was working. Behind her, Carmen returned to her work as if nothing had happened. But deep in her heart, a silent prayer rose. "Miguel, I will not give up, I promise." From the moment Carmen calmly endured Victoria's cruel humiliation, she knew the psychological warfare inside the Morrison mansion had escalated to a dangerous new level. What she didn't realize was that from a distance, someone else had begun watching her closely. Quietly, but with growing thoughtfulness. It was David Morrison. David rarely spent much time in the cold, pristine glass mansion. His life was consumed by billion-dollar architectural projects across 3 continents, and he seldom concerned himself with domestic matters. But on this day, fate seemed intent on placing him directly in the path of what had been nothing more than whispered rumors. Late in the afternoon, golden light from the setting sun spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Fresh from an important meeting with investors, David was exhausted and headed straight for his private office until the sharp, icy tone of Victoria's voice drifted from the master suite. "What on earth are you doing?" Something in her voice, familiar yet unusually harsh, made him slow down and stop outside the door. Through the narrow gap, he saw Carmen standing with her head bowed, trembling hands gripping a crystal sculpture that had nearly fallen from the glass shelf. It was a Lalique piece, a housewarming gift David had once given Victoria. He knew its value, but also that it wasn't worth such fury. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," Carmen murmured, her voice apologetic but steady. "I'll be more careful." Victoria didn't let her finish. Her hand shot out, striking Carmen's cheek with a sharp crack that nearly made her drop the sculpture again. "Careful?" Victoria hissed, emerald eyes flashing. "Do you know how much this is worth? You'll never own anything like this in your lifetime, Carmen. I'm done tolerating the carelessness and stupidity of people like you." David froze, stunned. He had known Victoria could be demanding, even cutting, but never had he imagined her being so openly brutal to a household employee. What shocked him even more was Carmen's response. No screaming, no tears, just silent endurance. Placing the sculpture carefully back on the shelf, Carmen bowed her head low and said softly, but with quiet resolve, "I understand, ma'am. I'll do better." Victoria's face twisted with frustration at the lack of reaction. With an irritated flick of her hand, she turned toward the door, nearly colliding with David. Their eyes met in a brief, tense moment. Victoria quickly recovered her usual cool facade, but David felt something new, discomfort at the look in his wife's eyes. "What happened?" he asked, his voice calm but weighted. "Nothing," Victoria replied too quickly, her tone edged and defensive. "Just the nanny's clumsiness." David glanced past her at Carmen, who was leaving the room with her head down, hands still trembling but eyes burning with quiet determination. A strange feeling stirred inside him, not quite anger, but sharp curiosity mixed with unease. "I think she understands her mistake," he said slowly, deliberately. "You don't have to be so harsh, Victoria." For the first time in their marriage, Victoria looked genuinely surprised by his pushback. "You don't understand, David," she countered coolly. "People like her only work well if you keep them under strict discipline. Otherwise, they get lazy and sloppy." "People like her?" David repeated, his voice tightening, his eyes narrowing with sudden probing sharpness. Victoria instantly realized her mistake. "I mean the staff," she amended quickly. "They need firm management." David said nothing more, his gaze lingering down the hallway where Carmen had disappeared. The silence seemed to unsettle Victoria. She turned and walked away. But David remained where he was, and for the first time in their marriage, a deep, disquieting doubt crept into his mind about his wife's character. That night, alone in his office, David found he couldn't shake the image of Carmen standing still, absorbing an unjust blow with almost inhuman composure. She was vulnerable, powerless, but possessed a resilience he had never witnessed before. It intrigued him, not only about her, but about Victoria, the woman he thought he knew so well. Staring out the window at the city lights below, David made a quiet decision. Starting tomorrow, he would pay closer attention to Carmen. Perhaps then he would uncover the truth behind the perfect facade of this mansion and the storms brewing within. From the moment David Morrison accidentally witnessed his wife's cruelty toward Carmen, he began observing his household more closely, especially Carmen herself. She was a Latina woman with a fragile appearance, yet carried an inner strength he couldn't quite define. For Victoria, however, Carmen's silence and unusual resilience only made her more irritated. That unsettling calm felt like defiance, and in Victoria's mind, Carmen became a target who had to be broken. In the days that followed, the Morrison mansion became a stage for a series of suspicious accidents, all aimed squarely at Carmen. One evening, while she was serving dinner to David and Victoria in the lavish dining room, Victoria suddenly stood. With a subtle but deliberate motion, she knocked over a glass of red wine, spilling it across an expensive white area rug in a violent crimson splash. "Why would you place the wineglass in such a careless spot, Carmen?" Victoria barked, her face a mask of feigned outrage. Every staff member's eyes snapped to Carmen, some wide with alarm. From his seat at the head of the table, David studied Carmen, expecting anger, a protest, or even tears. Instead, she simply knelt down and quietly blotted the spreading stain. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I'll be more careful," she said, calm, controlled, without a hint of resistance. David was intrigued, even unsettled. He knew Victoria's act was intentional, and Carmen seemed to know it too. Yet she chose to accept it without revealing a trace of indignation. What force, he wondered, allowed her to endure like this? But Victoria wasn't finished. Days later, as Carmen carefully dusted the living room, Victoria entered carrying a rare ceramic vase. She admired it for a moment before letting it slip from her hands. The priceless heirloom shattered into countless glittering pieces on the polished floor. The crash echoed through the hall, drawing staff to the scene. Victoria turned on Carmen, her fury perfectly staged. "You're so clumsy, Carmen. Do you have any idea what that vase was worth? I can't understand why they still keep you here. You're a disgrace to this house." The others froze, casting glances that mixed pity with curiosity. Everyone knew Victoria had done it deliberately, but no one dared defend Carmen. The silence was thick enough to hear Victoria's quick, angry breaths. David, standing just inside his office doorway, saw it all, His fists tightened, his mind swirling with suspicion and disappointment toward his wife. Yet again, Carmen's reaction astonished him. Without a word, she crouched, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered the fragments. She worked methodically, eyes down, until every sliver was gone. Then she rose, bowed her head slightly, and said in that same steady tone, "I apologize for my carelessness, ma'am." Victoria stared hard, hunting for a flicker of weakness or rebellion in Carmen's eyes. She found only stillness and an almost frightening dignity. Thwarted and frustrated, she turned sharply and left, leaving Carmen standing tall in the middle of the room. From across the way, David couldn't look away from her. Why didn't she cry? Why didn't she fight back? Why was she still here at all? Even the other staff began to see her differently. Where they once looked down on her for her background and position, they now felt a grudging respect. Patricia, the cold, exacting housekeeper, softened her gaze when Carmen passed. Susan and Robert no longer whispered behind her back. They watched her quietly, almost in admiration. Through sheer silence and unshakable endurance, Carmen had shown everyone in the Morrison mansion that real strength lay not in wealth or power, but in the ability to preserve one's dignity in the harshest circumstances. And that strength was beginning to change how everyone saw her. Most of all, David Morrison, the most powerful man in the house. In the days that followed, the air inside the Morrison mansion remained as stifling and tense as ever. Yet something seemed to be shifting quietly underneath. Carmen didn't realize that her patience and composure had left a small but unmistakable crack in the flawless facade Victoria had worked so hard to maintain. That afternoon, the sky turned dark and stormy. Heavy clouds rolled over Malibu like a bad omen. Carmen was cleaning the second-floor hallway, a place she rarely visited. As she passed the master suite, she heard something strange, a faint, strangled sob, soft but laden with pain. She stopped, uneasy. She had never heard a sound like that in this house, least of all from Victoria, who always wore armor of cold, intimidating poise. Then came a clearer sound, a tiny, broken cry. Carmen gently pushed the already open door a little wider. Victoria sat there on a velvet chair by the floor-to-ceiling window, her usually perfect black hair now loose and disheveled over her shoulders. Her hands trembled as they covered her face. Her shoulders shook with restrained sobs. It was the most fragile, vulnerable version of Victoria Carmen had ever seen. When Victoria noticed Carmen, she hurriedly wiped her tears, trying and failing to reassemble her icy mask. She turned away, her voice forced into firmness but threaded with hurt. "Who gave you permission to be here?" "I'm sorry, ma'am," Carmen answered softly. "I was cleaning the hall and happened to hear. Are you all right?" Victoria was silent for a long moment, as if she meant to order Carmen out immediately, but then her shoulders dropped like someone too tired to keep wearing a mask. "You wouldn't understand, Carmen," she whispered, her voice quivering with bitterness. "You could never understand what it feels like to be looked down on by everyone around you." Carmen froze. It was the first time Victoria had ever spoken to her with true weakness and honesty. Carmen stepped inside slowly, set her cleaning supplies aside, and kept a respectful distance, close enough to show she cared. "Ma'am, sometimes I do understand." Victoria lifted her eyes, startled as if she couldn't believe what she just heard. "David's family," Victoria continued, her tone edged with indescribable sourness. "They've never accepted me. They see me as a poor girl who married for money, someone obsessed with beauty and status. David's friends too. To them, I'm just an expensive decoration, nothing more." She let out a small laugh, but it carried a deep, bruised ache. "I used to think that if I acted strong, cold, strict with others, they'd have to respect me. But the more I did it, the lonelier and emptier I felt." Carmen listened quietly, and a strange feeling rose in her, something like empathy for the woman who had caused her so much pain. Her voice was low, tinged with sorrow. "I know what that feels like, ma'am." Victoria looked at her, suspicious at first, but the malice in her eyes was gone. Only sincere curiosity remained. "How could you possibly understand?" Carmen drew a slow breath, speaking clearly, steadily. "I have a son. His name is Miguel. He's 6, and he's been struggling with severe autism since he was little. I have nothing, not even enough to pay for his therapy. I've begged specialists to help him, even when I couldn't afford the sessions." Her voice tightened, but she kept her calm. Every day here, every time I endure the cruelty and humiliation, I tell myself I'm doing it for my child. Because if I can keep this job one more day, then I get one more chance for him to have the life he deserves." Silence fell over the room. Victoria looked at Carmen as if for the first time she truly saw her, not as a poor nanny, not as a Latina woman to be scorned, but as a mother, fierce and selfless. I didn't know," Victoria said at last, her voice shaking with remorse. "I always thought you were." Carmen gently shook her head, sparing her the rest. "I understand, ma'am. Everyone carries their own prejudices, but sometimes life forces us to change our perspective. I've been used to that for a long time." Victoria went quiet again, staring out the wide window where the dark clouds were thinning, letting through the last pale light of day. For the first time in her life, she felt genuine shame before Carmen, the woman she had most despised. And for the first time, Victoria realized that perhaps she was the truly weak one in this house. That afternoon, after Carmen left the room having shared her heartfelt story about her son with special needs, Victoria remained seated in silence by the window for a long time. For the first time in her life, she felt a strange mix of shame and genuine compassion, emotions she had never allowed herself to feel before. That night, Victoria lay awake, unable to sleep. The image of Carmen's sorrowful eyes and her trembling voice as she spoke about Miguel kept replaying in her mind, filling her with deep, gnawing guilt. Every cruel act, every word of humiliation she had hurled at Carmen now made her ask herself, "How did I become this person?" She thought back to her first steps into David Morrison's world of privilege. Then a poor girl from a small town, always plagued by the feeling that she didn't belong. The venomous words from her husband's family and friends had etched themselves into her memory over the years. Victoria is just a pretty, empty-headed woman, a decorative object, nothing more. Those words had driven her to build the cold, cutting facade that shielded her vulnerabilities. But now, faced with Carmen, a poor woman with an unbreakable heart, Victoria realized she had lost herself long ago. The next morning, Carmen rose early as usual, bracing for another grueling day. But when she entered the kitchen, Patricia unexpectedly handed her a small white envelope. Her stern face softened just slightly. "Mrs. Morrison says to open it now," Patricia said briefly before turning away. Carmen's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were several bills and a note written in Victoria's familiar, elegant script. "Take today off. Go see your son. This is for travel and to buy something for Miguel." For a moment, Carmen felt her heart stop. She read the note over and over, barely able to believe her eyes. For the first time since she'd entered the Morrison mansion, she felt genuine kindness from the woman she had thought the coldest, most unfeeling person alive. Without hesitation, Carmen quickly gathered a few small items and left for the specialized clinic where Miguel received therapy. Throughout the journey, her mind swirled with confusing but warm thoughts of Victoria and this sudden change in her. At the clinic, Carmen entered the small room where Miguel was working with his therapist. The little boy was focused on a puzzle, his movements careful and deliberate. When he saw his mother, his face lit up with pure joy. "Mama," Miguel called, his voice filled with excitement. Carmen rushed forward, pulling him into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face, tears of happiness and longing. It had been weeks since she could visit, and each time she'd only been able to speak with Miguel through video calls, her heart breaking. But today, thanks to Victoria's unexpected gesture, she could hold her son close and feel his warmth. "I missed you so much, Mama," Miguel whispered, his tears soaking into Carmen's shoulder. "I was scared you wouldn't come back." "I'm always here for you, Miguel," Carmen murmured, stroking his hair. "I will never leave you, no matter what." In that moment, Carmen felt deep gratitude for Victoria's unexpected kindness. She began to see that behind the coldness and cruelty might be a heart wounded and in need of healing. That evening, back at the mansion, Carmen quietly returned to her duties as if nothing had happened. But deep inside, she couldn't forget the silent generosity she had received that day. On the other side of the vast house, Victoria sat in her private room, staring into the large mirror, studying every line of her face. For the first time in years, she saw a different woman staring back, one filled with insecurity and scars, someone who had strayed far from who she truly was. She thought of Carmen, of Miguel, of the boundless sacrifice of a poor mother enduring every bitterness for her child. And she asked herself whether she had the courage to face herself and change, or whether she would keep living in the false armor she had built. Victoria stood, walked to the window, and gazed out over the sprawling gardens fading into the night. A new feeling stirred within her, a yearning to change, to live truthfully. And in that moment, she knew that while many challenges still lay ahead, she was no longer truly alone. Because for the first time, she understood that genuine compassion was the one true force capable of healing even the deepest wounds. In the days following her visit to Miguel at the clinic, Carmen began to notice a strange but undeniable change in Victoria. The sharp glares and cutting words that once felt like blades were gone, replaced by softer looks and small, considerate gestures she had never seen from the powerful woman before. One morning, as Carmen was carefully arranging fresh flowers in the living room, Victoria appeared behind her with an unusually thoughtful expression, her green eyes distant, as if weighing something carefully. "Carmen," she said, her tone calm, so different from the icy edge of the past. "Yes, ma'am," Carmen replied cautiously, turning toward her. Victoria hesitated, something rare for a woman so used to being decisive. At last, her voice softened, carrying a sincerity Carmen had never heard before. "Tomorrow night, I'm attending an important charity gala at the Beverly Hills Hotel. I want you to come with me." Carmen froze. She could hardly believe her ears. Never had she imagined Victoria Morrison, the very woman who had made her life so painful, would extend such an invitation. Stammering, she said, "Ma'am, I'm just a nanny. I don't think I belong in a place like that." Victoria, the architect's wife and the unbreakable nanny.